"You don't belong in this seat. People like you should know your place." The words cut through the hush of the boarding cabin like a blade against glass. For a split second, everything stilled. The shuffle of carry-ons halted, the hum of overhead vents seemed to pause, even the faint clink of a champagne flute froze in mid-air. Row 2, Seat A. Leather upholstery, polished tray, faint citrus scent of disinfectant, and a white man in a pressed blazer leaning forward, jaw tight, veins rising in his neck, refusing to budge. He wasn't whispering. He wanted everyone to hear. Passengers glanced up from their boarding passes. A woman clutched her scarf tighter. Somewhere near the galley, a soft chime signaled the closing of overhead bins. But all attention locked onto the aisle where a tall black man stood, still, silent, boarding pass in hand. Plain charcoal jacket, no tie, black t-shirt underneath. Nothing flashy. His expression unreadable. The insult hung in the air. He didn't fire back, didn't even blink. He simply held out the paper slip, Seat 2A, between two steady fingers. The man in the blazer sneered. "Don't try to bluff. This is first class." A ripple of tension spread. Row 3 leaned forward. Row 1 twisted back. The aisle clogged as boarding stalled. A faint smell of coffee wafted in from the galley, sharp against the rising heat of the confrontation. The black man's jaw shifted once, not clenched, restrained. His voice, when it came, was low, even, almost too calm. "This is my seat." 4 words, heavy as steel. The white passenger scoffed, loud enough for the cabin to catch. "Show me ID. People like you don't just sit here." Gasps, a muffled cough. Someone's water bottle dropped and rolled, the hollow clatter echoing far longer than it should have. The man still standing, boarding pass in hand, did not move. His eyes flicked once toward the flight attendant, frozen mid-step, then back to the man in the blazer who sat sprawled across 2A as if it were a throne. No raised voice, no wasted breath. "I said, this is my seat." The hush deepened. From somewhere down the aisle, a phone camera lifted, its red dot glowing. A child's voice whispered to his mother, "Why won't he let him sit?" The blazered man shifted, suddenly aware of the eyes around him, but his arrogance doubled down. He tugged at his collar, leaned back, and smirked. "Then prove it. Otherwise, get out before I call security." The words landed like a slap. The black man didn't flinch. He simply lowered his boarding pass onto the armrest, letting the bold black print, 2A, Horizon Airlines First Class, speak for itself. His other hand slid casually into his pocket, not fidgeting, just resting, as though time itself had slowed around him. The air conditioner hummed back to life, louder now, like static filling silence. A glass clinked again as a flight attendant adjusted a tray. The scene held, suspended, as if the whole aircraft leaned in to listen. Passengers waited for an explosion, a protest, a demand. But none came. Only that stillness. Only those calm eyes. And beneath it, something else flickered, something the man in 2A, something none of the staff, none of the gawking passengers yet understood. They thought they were staring at just another traveler, a nobody in plain clothes. What they didn't know, what would shock them all before the cabin doors closed, was that this nobody wasn't just a paying passenger. He was their boss, their owner, their reckoning. A chair scraped faintly against the cabin floor. A bell chimed. Someone cleared their throat, waiting to see what happened next. But before we dive deeper, before we get into this, let me pause and ask you something. Where are you watching from right now? Drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And, while you're here, hit that like button and make sure you subscribe, because the story you're about to hear isn't just drama. It's about injustice, arrogance, and the shocking twist that turned the entire cabin upside down before the plane even left the gate. What would you have done if you were standing there in that aisle? If you saw someone being told they don't belong, even though they had proof in hand? Would you have stayed quiet, or would you have spoken up? Because in the next few minutes, you're going to witness the exact moment when silence shattered. When passengers realized they weren't just watching an argument, they were watching history. Now, let's set the scene properly. Horizon Airlines Flight 41 and scene. Late afternoon, Chicago O'Hare International Airport. Boarding is almost complete. The cabin lights glow a soft amber. The smell of fresh brewed coffee drifts in from the galley, and in Seat 2A, a single confrontation is about to spiral from whispers into a storm. The boarding cabin hummed with that peculiar mixture of order and chaos unique to late afternoon departures. The overhead lights glowed a muted amber, softened by the polished paneling that framed the first-class section. The leather seats, wide, tan, meticulously stitched, smelled faintly of conditioner, mingling with the sharper scent of freshly brewed coffee drifting from the galley. Every few seconds, the air vents exhaled a cool stream that fluttered the corners of newspapers and travel documents. The cabin wasn't noisy, but it wasn't silent either. Snippets of conversations overlapped in low tones, a woman asking her husband about dinner plans in Los Angeles, a teenager humming behind his earbuds, the muffled crackle of a gate agent's voice over the PA outside the door. The rhythm of boarding was steady, the clack of luggage wheels against the aisle, the rustle of coats being stowed overhead, the faint metallic click of seatbelts being tested. Beyond the oval windows, the Chicago sky sagged heavy with late-day haze, streaked in gold where the sun slipped between clouds. Inside, though, the mood felt tighter. Passengers glanced sidelong at one another, not in hostility but in that silent calculation of proximity, who would be sitting near whom for the next 4 hours. In row 2, however, that calculus was no longer quiet. The seat that should have been unremarkable, 2A, was already swollen with tension, though most of the cabin didn't know why just yet. It wasn't only the insult hurled seconds earlier that poisoned the air, it was the way it lingered, like static before a storm. The kind of moment when a simple choice, sit or stand, speak or stay silent, could redraw the entire map of power in a room. He didn't look like someone who owned a fleet of companies who had spent years reshaping industries with boardroom decisions that shifted billions. Standing there in the aisle, he could have been anyone. A man in his 40s, tall but not imposing, dressed simply in a dark jacket over a plain t-shirt, jeans clean but ordinary, and sneakers that had seen more airports than red carpets. He traveled often but rarely revealed who he was. That anonymity was a choice. Power could come with security details, tailored suits, and a trail of assistants carrying briefcases. But he believed the truest measure of authority was presence, the kind that didn't need to announce itself. And yet, the eyes around him underestimated him instantly. To the man occupying his seat, he was a nuisance. To the flight attendant hesitating by the galley, he was a potential situation. To the watching passengers, he was simply another traveler who happened to be at the center of tension. What none of them realized, what would soon crack the cabin open, was that the man they were dismissing had signed contracts with this very airline. He was a CEO, a majority shareholder, and a strategist whose name could ripple through markets. But in this moment, he chose silence. His calm wasn't weakness, it was the exact opposite. He stood with a boarding pass held steady in his hand, the sharp black print catching the amber cabin light. His face was expressionless, but his stillness carried weight. He didn't need to raise his voice. The few words he had already spoken, "This is my seat," still echoed faintly in the minds of those close enough to hear. Every inch of his posture was deliberate. Shoulders relaxed, jaw unclenched, eyes locked not in anger, but in focus. He knew something the others didn't. This wasn't a confrontation, it was a test. And the man in 2A had already failed it. The man sprawled in seat 2A was white, mid-50s, with a face etched by entitlement rather than age. His blazer was immaculate, navy with silver thread pinstripes. His shoes shone with the kind of polish that suggested vanity more than care. A gold watch gleamed under his cuff as he gestured broadly, his voice pitched high enough to carry 2 rows in every direction. He wasn't alone. The flight attendant nearest the conflict, Nicole, early 30s, hair pulled back in a tight bun, hesitated at the junction between professional duty and personal bias. Her posture screamed caution, but her silence betrayed something else. Agreement. She hadn't told the man to lower his voice. She hadn't stepped in to confirm the ticket. Instead, her eyes darted to the boarding pass in the black man's hand, then quickly away, as if validating it might unravel her authority. Behind her, another attendant, Brian, leaned against the galley counter, smirking faintly as though the drama were entertainment. He was younger, mid-20s, restless, eager to fit into the hierarchy of crew life. The kind of man who echoed his seniors without thought. To him, this wasn't a breach of dignity. It was amusement. And then there was the manager, Captain Daniel Pierce, tall, stern, a man who believed his uniform was armor. He hadn't intervened yet, but the way his head turned from the cockpit, eyes narrowing, suggested he was already calculating how to frame the incident as procedure, not prejudice. The man in 2A leaned back, smug. "We can do this the easy way," he announced to no one in particular, his voice dripping disdain. "Or the hard way." It was his signature move, the assumption that tone plus volume equaled authority. It wasn't the first time he'd spoken like this. Frequent flyers had heard his kind before, the entitled passenger who wielded condescension like a boarding pass of its own. His words weren't just directed at the man standing in front of him. They were for the audience, the surrounding passengers, the staff who might nod silently rather than push back. Every arrogance has a pattern. His was obvious. First, the insult. Second, the demand. Third, soon to come, the escalation. And as the crew hesitated, their silence became complicity. The cabin was still boarding, but the whispers had started. A woman in row 3 leaned close to her husband. "Did you hear what he said?" A young man scrolling on his phone lowered it just slightly, his camera ready. A teenage girl by the window glanced nervously at the standing passenger, her lips forming a silent sorry that only he could catch. The flight attendant Nicole shifted her weight, sighing as if the whole scene was an inconvenience. Her radio clicked once, a subtle signal to her colleagues. "Might need ID check," she muttered under her breath. Not a policy, not a requirement, just a tactic. Another attendant, Brian, smirked louder this time, muttering to Nicole, "Probably a fake ticket. Happens all the time." His words weren't private. They were pitched just high enough to reach the passengers nearby. Ignored greetings drifted in the air. When the black man had first stepped into the cabin, no one had said, "Welcome." No eye contact, no smile. Just suspicion masked as indifference. Now, with tension tightening around row 2, those early emissions rang louder. Every storm begins with whispers. Every downfall begins with a look away. And then came the trigger. Nicole stepped forward, arms crossed, her voice clipped and firm. "Sir, show me your ID." The moment snapped like a match head catching flame. "ID," Nicole repeated, her tone clipped, authoritative, a thin veneer of professionalism stretched over doubt. The black man didn't flinch. He slid his driver's license from his pocket and placed it atop the boarding pass already resting on the armrest of 2A. The laminate caught the amber cabin light, reflecting his name in sharp black print. The passenger in 2A didn't even glance at it. He sneered. "Fake." Gasps broke out softly in nearby rows. A woman in 2C leaned forward, brow furrowed. "That's a government ID," she said under her breath, but her voice was too soft to shift the tide. Nicole's lips tightened. She didn't pick up the ID, didn't scan it. She simply crossed her arms. "Sir, this seat is already assigned. You'll need to step back and take your proper place." "My proper place?" His words were quiet, deliberate. The phrase hung heavy. The passenger in 2A smirked. "Exactly. Economy's that way." A cold hush spread through the cabin. The man standing didn't move. He didn't even reach for his ID again. He simply said, "My name is on that ticket. You saw it." Nicole shifted, uneasy but unwilling to relent. "Our system shows 2A occupied. So, unless you can provide additional proof of purchase—" He cut her off softly. "My proof is already in front of you." The stillness around him deepened, but Nicole's face hardened. "Sir, I'm giving you a final chance. Move to economy before this escalates further." The irony in her words was lost on her, because escalation had already begun. The man in 2A leaned back theatrically, spreading his arms along the armrests as though claiming territory. His voice rose, no longer directed at the black man, but at the surrounding passengers. "Look at this," he barked, "trying to scam his way into first class. Doesn't even belong here." Several heads turned fully now. Row 3 whispered audibly. A businessman in row 1 raised his brow but said nothing. Nicole didn't correct him. Instead, she mirrored his energy, lifting her chin and speaking louder. "Sir, this is disrupting boarding. If you don't comply, we'll have to call security." The words ricocheted through the cabin like an alarm. Passengers froze mid-motion. Someone's suitcase bumped noisily into a seat. The tension snapped from private humiliation to public spectacle. The black man didn't raise his voice. He simply looked at the seat, his seat, then back to Nicole. "You haven't even checked your tablet." Brian, still leaning in the galley, laughed softly. "He probably printed it at home," he muttered, loud enough for row 3 to hear. That drew a chuckle from 2A, who now looked emboldened, almost triumphant. He tapped the armrest with his gold watch. "This is how they do it. Fake tickets, fake IDs, trying to sneak where they don't belong." The black man's eyes shifted, once toward the nearest phone camera, now raised steadily by a woman in row 4. His jaw didn't tighten. His shoulders didn't stiffen. He simply stood taller. And in a voice calm but cutting, he said, "You've mistaken silence for weakness." The passengers closest shivered at the weight in those words. Nicole, however, heard only defiance. "That's enough," she snapped. "I'm escalating this." She tapped her radio. "Captain, we need support in first class." The humiliation was no longer whispered, it was broadcast. The dominoes fell quickly. Nicole snatched the boarding pass and ID off the armrest and handed them to Brian. "Run these through verification," she ordered. Brian didn't move toward the scanner. Instead, he pocketed the documents casually, smirking as though he'd just pocketed evidence. "Suspicious," he muttered, shaking his head. The passenger in 2A laughed. "See, even the staff knows." The black man's eyes followed the documents disappearing into Brian's uniform pocket. His voice stayed calm. "Return them." Brian chuckled. "Policy, sir. We'll hold them until security clears you." Phones lifted higher. The woman in row 4 whispered into hers, "They just took his ID. He showed everything and they still—" A teenager 2 rows back pulled out his phone too. "This is going online," he muttered. Nicole ignored them. She turned back to the black man. "Sir, for your safety and ours, I need you to step aside." "For my safety?" he asked, voice softly. Nicole nodded curtly. "Exactly." The word safety felt like a blade. It wasn't protection, it was weaponization. Passengers shifted uncomfortably. A few looked at one another, silently asking, "Is this really happening?" The black man lowered his gaze for the first time, not in submission, but in measured restraint. "You've crossed a line," he said. Nicole stiffened. "Final warning." Brian leaned against the galley wall, smirking, phone still glowing in his pocket. The man in 2A drummed his fingers on the armrest like a judge awaiting a verdict. And in that tense, simmering silence, the moment felt less like boarding and more like trial. The captain emerged, Daniel Pierce, tall, jaw set, uniform pressed within an inch of perfection. His eyes scanned the aisle, narrowing instantly on the black man standing. "What seems to be the issue?" Nicole straightened. "Passenger in the wrong seat. Refusing to comply. Possible fraudulent ticket." Daniel's gaze swept over the standing man's plain clothes, sneakers, calm posture. He didn't ask for details. He didn't glance at the boarding pass still withheld. He simply nodded once. "Sir, you'll need to come with me." The black man didn't move. Passengers murmured. Someone whispered, "But he showed his ticket." The captain's tone sharpened. "If you don't comply, we'll have you removed." "Removed," the black man repeated quietly. His voice wasn't mocking. It was heavy, deliberate. "Yes," Daniel confirmed. "We have VIP passengers waiting for this seat." Gasps. Row 3 erupted in whispers. A woman in 2C spoke louder now. "But that's his seat. I saw the pass. It said 2A." Nicole shot her a glare. "Ma'am, stay out of this." The woman bristled. "No, I won't. This isn't right." The tension spiked. Phones were fully raised now. A man in row 4 whispered into his, "The captain just said there are VIPs taking his seat." The word VIPs cracked the facade wide open. This wasn't about policy. It was about preference. The black man finally spoke again, his tone steady, razor sharp. "You're making a mistake you can't walk back." The captain stiffened. "That sounds like a threat." "No," the man said softly. "It's a promise, Masaib." The cabin erupted, not in chaos but in murmurs rising like a tide. "He showed his ID. I saw the pass." "They took it from him." A middle-aged woman, Latina, stood from 2C, her phone raised high. "I'm recording this," she declared. "He had the seat. You're lying." A man in row 1 muttered, "This is discrimination, plain and simple." The teenager, 2 rows back, live-streamed, his caption already reading, "Black man denied seat in first class despite valid ticket." Nicole's composure cracked. "Everyone stay seated, phones down." But no one listened. The passenger in 2A smirked, leaning back further as though basking in the chaos he'd ignited. "Told you?" he murmured smugly. The black man looked at him once, just once, and the smirk faltered. There was something in that calm gaze, something that suggested this wasn't humiliation. It was documentation. And then a voice cut through the murmurs. A young attendant, Mia Lang, trainee uniform slightly wrinkled, stepped forward from the galley. Her voice trembled at first, but found strength fast. "His ticket scanned green. I saw it. He belongs here." Every head turned. Nicole's jaw tightened. "Mia, not your place." But the crowd had shifted. Whispers swelled into open murmurs, then into statements, then into outrage. "You can't do this. This is wrong. Let him sit." A wall of phones formed, glowing red dots everywhere. The balance of power tilted. And the final spark came when Nicole, desperate, hissed under her breath, just loud enough for the camera nearest to catch it. "People like him always think they can cheat the system." Gasps. The tide turned fully. Passengers weren't just witnesses anymore. They were jurors. The air in the cabin felt electric, ready to combust. Nicole clutched her radio. The captain loomed, and security was already en route. But as the black man stood silent in the aisle, eyes steady, a sound began to overlap, soft, rhythmic, echoing from somewhere deeper. Footsteps, heavy, growing closer. A cue, not to chaos but to memory. The footsteps echoing down the jet bridge blended into another rhythm, faster, sharper, the slap of sneakers against a school hallway. He was 12. Locker-lined walls loomed over him, smelling of bleach and chalk dust. A cluster of boys blocked the doorway to the cafeteria, their voices carrying the same tone he'd just heard in 2A. "You don't belong here. Go sit with the others." They shoved his tray back into his chest. Plastic cracked, milk spilled cold across his shirt. Laughter exploded. Teachers looked away. He didn't shout. He didn't cry. He stood still, eyes steady, hands gripping the tray until the laughter died on its own. Then he walked past them, sat at the end of an empty table and ate quietly with milk still soaking his shirt. That night, his father sat across from him at the kitchen table. The smell of cornbread lingered in the air. His father's voice was steady, a mirror of his own decades later. "Never raise your voice when they want you to. That's what they expect. You raise the truth. You let silence cut sharper than any insult." The boy nodded. He didn't forget. The echo of footsteps shifted, slower now, firmer, the measured sound of polished shoes across marble. He was 24. Downtown, office tower. His first real job interview. He wore his only suit, navy, pressed twice that morning. He sat in the waiting area, resume balanced on his knees, watching executives pass by in expensive tailoring. When his turn came, the manager looked him up and down once, then forced a polite smile. "We're looking for someone who fits our image," he said. "Maybe try a smaller firm." The interview lasted 3 minutes. Outside, the city air pressed hot against his skin, thick with car exhaust. He loosened his tie, not from heat, but from the choke of rejection. That night he stared at his reflection in the dark glass of a bus window. The word image replayed, stinging sharper than failure. He didn't rage, he didn't despair, he built. He poured the rejection into his own business plan. Long nights, borrowed office space, second-hand laptops, too much coffee. Every sneer, every dismissal became fuel. He learned how to negotiate by listening longer than anyone else. He learned patience. Not because he wanted to, but because the world forced it on him. And with patience came power. The sound shifted again, this time the slam of a drawer, present overlapping with past. He was 32. His company had just lost a deal. Not because their numbers were weak, but because the boardroom had whispered, "Too young, too different." Not our kind of partner. He stood in his office after hours, the city skyline flickering outside, neon bleeding through the blinds. His assistant apologized for the lost deal. He didn't answer right away. He opened the desk drawer, pulled out the rejection letter, and set it atop a growing stack. Then, softly, he whispered the words that would guide him from that day on. Never again. He didn't mean he'd never face rejection. He meant he'd never let someone else define his belonging. That vow stayed with him. Through every deal, every contract, every boardroom where silence tested him, he carried those words like armor. Return to present. The slam of the drawer faded, morphing seamlessly back into the heavy thud of security boots on the aircraft floor. The cabin came back into focus. Phones raised, whispers loud, tension crackling in the recycled air. He was no longer 12 with milk on his shirt, no longer 24 clutching a failed interview, no longer 32 vowing to fight back. He was here in 46, calm, silent, and about to turn humiliation into reckoning. The boots of security thudded closer until 2 officers appeared in the aisle, uniforms sharp, radios crackling faintly. One rested a hand near his belt, the other scanned the passengers with a look that carried authority but also unease. Nicole exhaled like a woman vindicated. "Gentlemen, remove him. Wrong seat, false documents." Brian slipped the boarding pass and ID from his pocket, offering them up as if they were contraband. "See? Clearly altered." The passenger in 2A leaned forward, smirking at the officers. "Told you, he doesn't belong here." His voice oozed victory, like he'd just won something larger than a seat. The black man's posture didn't change. He stood tall, hands at his sides, calm as still water. The taller officer nodded once. "Sir, we're going to need you to step aside." And then came the final spark. The insult sharpened into a blade. The man in 2A sneered loud enough for the whole cabin to hear. "Get him out before he lowers the standard of first class." The words sliced through the cabin. Gasps erupted. A woman muttered, "Did he just say that?" Phones lifted higher. The black man finally looked down at the man in 2A. For the first time, a faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Not amusement, but the kind of smile that comes when a storm decides where to land. He said nothing, not yet, but silence was no longer weakness. Silence was strategy. The air in the cabin thickened. Passengers held their breath. Even the overhead fans seemed to hush. Mia, the young trainee attendant, stepped forward again. Her voice trembled but rang clear. "He's telling the truth. That's his seat. I saw it," Nicole snapped. "Quiet, Mia. You're jeopardizing your career." But the tide had already turned. From row 3, a man stood halfway. "She's right. He showed his ticket. You tore it up." Whispers swelled into words, words into declarations. "This is wrong. Let him sit. He paid for that seat." The officers hesitated. Their training told them to act. Their instincts told them the crowd was shifting. And in the middle of it all, the black man stood unmoved, calm eyes scanning the cabin like a judge watching a courtroom weigh its verdict. Phones recorded every flicker of expression, every syllable muttered by crew. Somewhere in the back, a passenger whispered to his camera, "This is going viral, already trending." Nicole folded her arms tighter. "This flight doesn't leave until he's off." The captain's voice cut sharp. "Enough! Passenger is non-compliant. Remove him." The taller officer stepped closer. His hand hovered near the black man's shoulder. The moment tightened like a bowstring, ready to snap. The crowd leaned in. Silence ballooned. The air felt electric, waiting for the sound that would break it. And then, finally, he spoke. "You want to remove me?" His voice was low, deliberate, yet it carried through the cabin like steel striking stone. "Then you'd better call the boardroom first." Confusion rippled. Passengers glanced at one another. The officer froze mid-motion. Nicole scoffed. "Boardroom? Please, enough games." The black man reached slowly into his jacket. Not abrupt, not threatening. Calm. He pulled out a matte black card, engraved with his full name, and held it steady in the dim cabin light. The man in 2A leaned forward, squinting. His smirk faltered. Nicole rolled her eyes. "Another fake card. You think we haven't seen this?" The black man tilted the card so the embossed logo caught the light. Horizon Airlines Executive Board. Then, without a hint of drama, he pulled a second item from his pocket. A laminated ID clipped with a silver crest, the kind no passenger carried. He held it out, his voice is cut clean. "My name is Marcus Carter, CEO, 25% shareholder of Horizon Airlines." The words detonated. Gasps rippled like a shockwave. Phones jerked higher. A woman in row 1 covered her mouth. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." The captain froze, color draining from his face. Nicole staggered back a step. Brian's smirk evaporated entirely. And the man in 2A, who had just sneered about lowering standards, sat stone still, lips parted, suddenly very small in the wide leather seat. The black man's voice stayed calm, almost quiet. "And you've all just shown me exactly how my passengers are treated when you think no one's watching." The silence that followed was deafening. Then came the shift. Passengers erupted, not in chaos but in applause, murmurs, affirmations. "I knew it. He was right. You can't treat people like that." The officers stepped back immediately, hands lowered. One muttered, "Sir, apologies," but Marcus cut him off with a glance. Nicole tried to recover. "Mr. Carter, we didn't know." "That's the problem," he said quietly. "You didn't need to know who I was. You only needed to respect the ticket in my hand." The captain swallowed hard, his uniform no longer armor. "Sir, if we can resolve—" "This is the resolution," Marcus replied. He turned to Mia, the trainee. "Escort me to my seat, please." Mia blinked, stunned, then nodded quickly. She stepped forward, retrieving the boarding pass from Brian's limp hand. "Seat 2A," she said firmly. "Confirmed." Marcus walked past the officers, past Nicole, past the smirking man who now shrank in his stolen seat. He stopped, looked down at him, and said softly, "Stand up." The man hesitated, face pale. Marcus didn't repeat himself. He didn't need to. The weight in his eyes was enough. The man rose slowly, stepping aside, his arrogance dissolved. Marcus sat down in 2A, the seat he had owned from the beginning, not as a victory, but as a statement. Passengers applauded again, louder this time. Mia handed him a glass of water. Marcus took one sip, set it on the tray, and turned to the captain. "This plane doesn't move until accountability does." The cabin was no longer an airplane. It was a courtroom, and justice had just declared itself present. The applause softened into murmurs, into whispers heavy with awe. Marcus leaned back in 2A, calm as he had been from the start. But his next words were not for himself. They were for every passenger, every silent witness. Respect should never depend on appearance. The principle hung in the air like a verdict. The air in first class held the weight of judgment. Phones were still raised, cameras blinking red, passengers whispering in disbelief. Marcus leaned slightly forward in his seat, calm but unwavering. "Captain," he said evenly, "before this flight leaves the ground, this crew is held accountable." Daniel Pierce's jaw flexed. He looked at Nicole, at Brian, at the man from 2A, now hovering shamefaced in the aisle. His authority had evaporated the moment Marcus revealed himself. "Mr. Carter, with respect, may I suggest—" Marcus cut him off gently, without raising his voice. "No suggestions, actions. Nicole Harris and Brian Foster are relieved of duty effective immediately. Your access is revoked." Gasps. Nicole's lips parted, shock replacing her arrogance. You can't just—" Marcus slid his ID calmly across the tray. The silver crest gleamed. "I can, and I will. Your conduct has been recorded by half this cabin. This isn't just misconduct. This is systemic bias, and you've just proven it under my own roof." Brian opened his mouth, but no words came. His smirk was gone. His hands trembled slightly as he set down the boarding pass he'd pocketed earlier. A gate manager, alerted by Marcus's call moments before, stepped aboard with 2 standby crew members. The handover was quiet, efficient. Nicole and Brian were escorted down the aisle, faces pale, every passenger's phone tracking their walk of shame. The cabin didn't cheer. It didn't need to. The silence was heavier than applause. The moment the crew left, voices began to rise, not in complaint, but in support. From row 3, the Latina woman who had spoken earlier stood, her phone still raised. "He showed his ticket. I saw it. He never raised his voice. They tried to erase him, and we all watched it happen." Passengers murmured agreement. Man in row 1 added, "I didn't speak soon enough. That's on me, but I see it now, clear as day." Marcus turned his head toward them. "The power of silence is dangerous," he said softly, "but so is the power of truth. Today, you all decided which one to keep." A ripple of applause swept through the cabin, not chaotic, but steady, deliberate. Some passengers clapped slowly, others nodded. Even those who hadn't spoken earlier now murmured words of support. Mia, the trainee attendant, stood a little taller. Her eyes glistened as Marcus glanced her way. "You spoke when it mattered," he told her. "That's leadership." Passengers captured her stunned expression on video, one that would later circulate as a symbol of courage. The man who had been seated in 2A stood awkwardly by the galley, his arrogance drained. He tried to stammer an apology. Marcus didn't even look at him. The man slumped away, escorted back to economy without another word. Justice wasn't shouted. It was delivered in silence, steady as gravity. With the cabin quiet again, Marcus leaned back in his seat. The glass of water on his tray trembled faintly with the hum of the engines beginning to spool. Passengers were still buzzing softly, but now their energy had shifted, from tension to relief, from outrage to respect. The balance of the flight had reset. The captain cleared his throat over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be departing shortly. We thank you for your patience, and on behalf of Horizon Airlines, we extend our apology." But Marcus shook his head slightly, then stood. Every eye followed him. He turned to face the cabin, his voice calm but carrying to every corner. "This was never about one seat," he said. "It was about dignity. And let me be clear, dignity is not first class. Dignity is the baseline. Every passenger deserves it." The words landed heavy, undeniable. Phones caught them. Hearts absorbed them. He sat again, finally at peace in 2A. The hum of the engines deepened, the runway waiting. Passengers exhaled together, as if a storm had passed, and just before the cabin door sealed, Marcus whispered a line that would outlive the flight, carried in every retelling, every replayed clip. "You don't need power to demand respect, you only need truth." The engines roared. The plane rolled forward, but something far greater had already taken off inside that cabin. As the plane lifted, passengers glanced at one another, strangers bound by a story they'd never forget. And in the quiet of ascent, a deeper reflection lingered. Because what had just happened wasn't only justice served, it was a reminder. The hum of the engine steadied as the aircraft climbed into the clouded dusk. But inside the cabin, the real turbulence had already passed. Passengers leaned back, eyes wide, still processing. Phones dimmed, conversations hushed, yet something lingered in the air. Not just relief, but recognition. Because this was never just about a seat. It was about the invisible lines people draw between belonging and not belonging. About how easily bias hides behind words like policy or protocol Or VIP, words meant to sound neutral but sharpened to wound. Respect should never depend on appearance. Dignity should never be conditional. Truth should never need a title to be heard. When one man in 2A decided to weaponize prejudice, the cabin became a mirror. Some stayed quiet, looking down at their screens. Others whispered uneasily, afraid to intervene. But a few spoke. A few raised their phones, their voices, their courage. And that small resistance shifted everything. Bias doesn't always shout. Sometimes it smirks behind a gold watch. Sometimes it hides in a torn boarding pass. Sometimes it pretends to protect safety while stripping away dignity. But the moment someone calls it out, calm, steady, undeniable, the mask slips. And when truth stands tall, silence can no longer stay seated. The moral is simple, but not easy. Never measure worth by image. Measure it by humanity. Whether in a boardroom, a bank, a hotel lobby, or a first-class cabin, the same principle holds. If you were in that situation, if you saw someone told they don't belong, would you have stayed silent, or would you have stood up? Because justice is rarely dramatic. Sometimes it's just one calm voice saying, "This is my seat." And with that, the story turns to you, the viewers, the witnesses beyond the cabin walls. So now it comes to you. If you were on that flight, sitting in row 3 or row 7 or standing in the aisle, what would you have done? Would you have stayed quiet, hoping it ended quickly? Or would you have spoken, filmed, raised your voice when it mattered? Because silence is a choice, and so is courage. Marcus Carter didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to boast about who he was. All he needed was the truth, and a few witnesses brave enough to stand with him. That's what shifted the tide. That's what turned humiliation into justice. If this story moved you, don't just close the window. Leave a comment below. What would you have done? Hit like if you believe respect should never depend on appearance. And don't forget to subscribe, because stories like this one are not just entertainment, they're reminders. Reminders that dignity is not a luxury seat, it's the baseline for every human being. And if you think this story was powerful, wait until you hear what happened when another CEO walked into a hotel lobby and was told, "This place isn't for your kind." That's the next story, but for now, this one lands here. Thank you for watching. Thank you for standing tall.